Poor girl said, "I think there's a mistake." Billionaire mocked, until the system showed the error. Before continuing, please indicate in the comments which city you are watching from. The gleaming towers of downtown Chicago pierced the gray winter sky like steel monuments to ambition. Inside the marble fortress of First National Private Bank, the most exclusive financial institution in the Midwest, silence reigned supreme. The kind of silence that only existed in places where whispers could move millions and a single signature could change destinies. Fahd al-Mansour stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce, his tailored Italian suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the harsh wind. At 38, he was the embodiment of calculated success, oil money refined through Harvard Business School, with investments spanning 3 continents. His presence in Chicago wasn't scheduled. When billionaires made surprise visits, it meant one thing: something significant was about to happen. The bank's employees had received the alert 20 minutes earlier. Mr. Al-Mansour is en route. All departments on standby. Phones buzzed, elevators hummed with nervous energy, and the marble floors gleamed under the frantic polishing of custodial staff who suddenly appeared from nowhere. Outside, 7-year-old Scarlett pressed her small hands against the massive glass doors, her breath fogging the pristine surface. Her sneakers, more tape than fabric, squelched against the wet pavement. In her pocket, a crumpled piece of paper bore an address. This address. Someone had told her mama before mama got too sick to remember things, that there might be something here, something that belonged to them. The warmth from inside the bank felt like a promise. Scarlett didn't understand the world of finance, didn't know that the building she was about to enter housed more money than most people would see in a lifetime. She only knew that her stomach ached from hunger, and that piece of paper in her pocket might hold answers. As Fahd's polished shoes clicked across the marble, and Scarlett's worn sneakers shuffled toward the entrance, 2 worlds were about to collide in ways neither could imagine. The transformation inside First National Private Bank was remarkable. In less than 30 minutes, the already pristine lobby had been elevated to showroom perfection. Fresh orchids replaced yesterday's arrangements, while employees who normally worked behind closed doors suddenly found themselves strategically positioned in the main hall, creating an atmosphere of bustling importance. Fahd al-Mansour entered like royalty inspecting his kingdom. Regional Director Marcus Webb, a man whose confidence usually filled rooms, now followed 3 steps behind, briefcase in hand, reciting updates about the Meridian investment portfolio, a multi-billion-dollar venture that had consumed Fahd's attention for months. The documentation from the European subsidiaries arrived this morning, Webb continued, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who knew his words were being weighed carefully. However, we're still encountering that authorization issue with the legacy accounts. The system keeps flagging certain transactions as requiring additional verification. Fahd's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For 18 months, a mysterious roadblock had prevented him from accessing a portion of investments tied to his late wife's financial network. Layla had been brilliant with numbers, creating intricate webs of holdings and trusts that even now, 3 years after her death, continued to generate wealth he couldn't touch. The bank's legal team assured him it was a matter of paperwork, of finding the right digital keys to unlock what was rightfully his. The system, Fahd said, his accent giving weight to each word, should recognize my authority by now. How difficult is it to override a software glitch? Sir, it's not exactly a glitch, Webb replied carefully. It appears your late wife implemented some form of secondary authorization protocol. We've been working with our IT security team to find a solution. Fahd cut him off. I didn't fly to Chicago to hear about problems. I came for results. Meanwhile, at the main entrance, Scarlett's small form created a stark contrast against the grandeur surrounding her. The uniformed security guard, Thomas Rodriguez, had noticed her hovering outside for nearly 10 minutes. His initial instinct was to shoo her away. Homeless children weren't uncommon in this part of the city. But something about her determined stance made him pause. She wasn't begging. She wasn't causing trouble. She was simply waiting. When she finally pushed through the rotating door, the whoosh of warm air lifted her tangled hair. Her eyes, a striking green that seemed too bright for her weathered face, took in the marble columns, the crystal chandeliers, the serious-faced people in expensive clothes. This was a different world, one she'd only seen in movies. At the information desk, receptionist Jennifer Clark was in the middle of reorganizing client files when she noticed the small figure approaching. Jennifer prided herself on reading people quickly. It was essential in private banking, and this child clearly didn't belong. "Excuse me, honey," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the practiced politeness reserved for dealing with obvious mistakes. "Are you looking for someone? Did you get separated from your parents?" Scarlett clutched her piece of paper tighter. I think I have something here. In this bank." A few nearby clients turned to look, some smiling at what they assumed was a charming misunderstanding. Jennifer's expression softened with the kind of patronizing kindness adults often showed confused children. "Sweetie, this is a private bank. We don't really have things for little girls. Maybe you're thinking of a different place." But Scarlett shook her head with surprising firmness. "My mama said the paper has the right address. She said to check if there's anything for Scarlett McKenna." The name meant nothing to Jennifer, but the child's persistence was starting to draw attention. In the background, she could hear Mr. Al-Mansour's voice carrying across the lobby, discussing investments worth more than most people's annual salaries. The last thing they needed was a disruption during such an important visit. "Tell you what," Jennifer said, deciding to humor the child quickly before finding a gentle way to escort her out. "Let me just check our system, okay? What did you say your name was?" "Scarlett McKenna." As Jennifer's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to perform a perfunctory search that would yield no results, she had no idea that she was about to trigger a sequence of events that would shatter everything. Everyone in that room thought they knew. The keystrokes echoed in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the reception area. Jennifer typed with the efficient speed of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times, expecting to see the familiar "no results found" message that would allow her to gently redirect the child elsewhere. Instead, her computer screen flickered. "That's odd," Jennifer murmured, frowning at the display. The search was taking longer than usual, with a loading icon spinning where results should appear. "The system seems to be running slowly today." Scarlett stood on her tiptoes, trying to see over the marble counter. Around them, the morning's banking activities continued, the soft murmur of financial consultations, the rustle of important documents, the discreet clicking of keyboards managing enormous sums of money. But there was a growing awareness that something unusual was happening at the information desk. From across the lobby, Fahad's attention was drawn to the commotion. His conversation with Director Webb had reached a natural pause, and his sharp businessman's instincts were always alert to disruptions in controlled environments. He noticed the small figure at the reception desk, clearly out of place among the business suits and designer handbags. "What's happening over there?" he asked Webb, who followed his gaze. "Probably just someone who wandered into the wrong building," Webb replied dismissively. "Jennifer will handle it." But Jennifer was not handling it. The loading icon on her screen had been replaced by something she'd never seen before, a series of security prompts requiring authorization levels far above her clearance. Red warning boxes appeared, indicating that the search had triggered protected protocols. "This is very strange," she said, more to herself than to Scarlett. "I'm going to need to call my supervisor." The word supervisor seemed to ripple outward like a pebble dropped in still water. Other employees began to take notice. Mrs. Patricia Holbrook, the senior account manager, approached the desk with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems before they escalated. "What seems to be the issue, Jennifer?" "This young lady is looking for an account under the name Scarlett McKenna, but the system is asking for security clearances I don't have." Patricia's eyebrows rose. In 15 years at First National Private Bank, she'd seen security protocols activated for international money laundering investigations, federal oversight audits, and transactions involving foreign governments. She'd never seen them triggered by a child's inquiry. "Let me try from my terminal," Patricia said, moving to her workstation. Her clearance level was significantly higher than Jennifer's, allowing access to accounts that required additional privacy protections. By now, the unusual situation had captured the attention of most of the lobby. Fahad found himself walking closer, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. There was something about the child's calm persistence that reminded him of... He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Patricia's fingers flew across her keyboard with practiced precision. She entered her supervisor codes, navigated through multiple security layers, and initiated a comprehensive account search. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then her screen went completely black. "What the hell?" Patricia whispered, immediately regretting the unprofessional language in front of a client as important as Mr. Al-Mansour, who was now standing directly behind her. The black screen lasted only seconds before being replaced by something extraordinary, a cascade of data files, account numbers, and legal documents that began populating faster than anyone could read. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the speed of the information. It was the security classification at the top of every document. Restricted access, authorization, required estate holdings, LL, Al-Mansour, secondary beneficiary. Protocols activated. Fahdy's face went completely white. "Layla," he breathed, recognizing his late wife's initials in the file headers. Scarlett, still standing on her tiptoes, looked up at the tall man whose expression had suddenly changed from curiosity to shock. "Is that good news or bad news?" she asked, with the innocent directness that only children possess. The question hung in the air as more files continued to populate Patricia's screen, each one revealing layers of financial arrangements that no one in the bank had known existed. And at the center of it all was a 7-year-old girl in worn sneakers who had just inadvertently unlocked the most protected secrets in the building. Fahd stared at the screen, then at Scarlett, then back at the screen. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible. "Who exactly are you, child?" The silence that followed Fahd's question seemed to stretch across eternity. Every person in the lobby had unconsciously moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the reception desk where impossible things were happening on Patricia's computer screen. The data continued to cascade: legal documents, financial statements, and authorization codes that shouldn't exist. Scarlett looked up at the tall man with the strange accent, her green eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "I'm just Scarlett," she said simply. "Scarlett McKenna. My mama's name was Rose McKenna, but she got sick and couldn't remember things good anymore." Director Webb stepped forward, his professional instincts kicking in despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Sir, perhaps we should move this conversation to a private office. We're drawing quite a crowd." But Fahd seemed frozen, his eyes locked on the screen where his late wife's digital signature appeared on document after document. "McKenna," he repeated slowly. "Aunt Rose McKenna." The name triggered a memory, something Layla had mentioned years ago during one of their late-night conversations about her childhood in Boston. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the files. Her 20-year career in private banking had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for this. "Mr. Al-Mansour," she said carefully, "it appears that your late wife established a secondary trust structure, one that requires dual authorization." "What does that mean?" Scarlett asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, the bank's chief legal counsel, had appeared from seemingly nowhere, summoned by the growing commotion. She was a woman who understood complex financial instruments the way others understood simple recipes, and what she saw on the screen made her pulse quicken. "It means," Eleanor said, kneeling down to Scarlett's eye level, "that your mother and Mr. Al-Mansour's wife were connected somehow, and they created a very special kind of account that needed both of their permissions to open." Fahd's mind raced backward through time, searching for connections he might have missed. Layla had been secretive about certain aspects of her past, not out of deception, but from a kind of protective instinct that he'd learned to respect. She'd grown up in foster care, had spoken occasionally of people who'd been kind to her during difficult times. "Rose," he whispered suddenly, the memory crystallizing. "Layla mentioned a Rose once. She said Rose was the only person who'd ever treated her like family when she was young." Scarlett's face brightened with recognition. "Mama always talked about a girl named Layla. She said Layla was like her sister, but they got separated when they grew up. Mama said Layla was really smart and was going to do important things." The pieces of an impossible puzzle began falling into place. Patricia continued scrolling through the documents, revealing a financial arrangement so complex and carefully constructed that it spoke of planning that had taken years. At its heart was a simple concept. Layla Al-Mansour had created a safety net for the daughter of the woman who had been her only family. Yes, this is extraordinary, Eleanor breathed, reading over Patricia's shoulder. Mrs. Almansour established a progressive trust fund tied to specific triggers, educational milestones, age markers, and emergency situations. But it could only be activated by someone with legitimate claim to the McKenna family line. Security guard Thomas Rodriguez, who had been watching from the periphery, stepped forward. "The little girl," he said quietly. "She's been coming here for weeks, standing outside watching. I thought she was just trying to get warm, but she was always holding that piece of paper." Scarlett reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled document that had brought her here. It was barely legible, water-stained and worn from countless foldings, but when Eleanor examined it, she gasped. It was a handwritten note in Layla's distinctive script. "For Rose's daughter, when she's old enough to understand. The bank in Chicago holds what I couldn't give her mother. Use this address. Tell them your name is Scarlett McKenna. Tell them Layla remembered." Fahad's breath caught in his throat. His wife's handwriting was as familiar to him as his own reflection, and seeing it now felt like receiving a message from beyond. "She planned this," he said, wonder and heartbreak mixing in his voice. Even before Rose had a daughter, Layla was planning for this moment. But the revelation was far from over. As Eleanor continued to examine the legal documents on the screen, her expression grew increasingly amazed. "Mr. Al-Mansour," she said carefully, "this isn't just a trust fund. Your wife used Scarlett's future inheritance as collateral for a much larger financial structure. The investments you've been trying to access, the ones blocked by authorization protocols, they're all tied to this account." The implication hit Fahad like a physical blow. For 18 months, he'd been frustrated by his inability to access portions of his own financial empire, never realizing that the key wasn't a password or a legal document. It was a 7-year-old girl in worn sneakers who carried her guardian angel's handwriting in her pocket. Webb cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, the legal ramifications of this discovery are significant. We're looking at a multi-generational financial arrangement that predates our current security protocols." Scarlett, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the patient, attention children develop when they don't understand the words but sense the importance, finally spoke up. "Does this mean I don't have to worry about Mama's medicine anymore?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Around them, the morning bustle of the bank had completely stopped. Employees stood frozen at their desks. Clients waited with forgotten transactions, and even the background hum of computers seemed to have quieted. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a financial revelation, but the unfolding of a story that connected past and present in ways that defied coincidence. Fahad looked down at the small girl who had unknowingly held the key to his wife's final gift. In her eyes, he saw reflections of the woman who had been his anchor, his conscience, his reminder that wealth meant nothing without compassion. Layla had known this day would come. She had known that Rose's daughter would eventually need help, and she had known that Fahad would be the one to provide it. "No, little one," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You'll never have to worry about medicine again." The private conference room on the 15th floor of First National Private Bank had hosted negotiations worth billions of dollars, but never anything quite like this. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, where ice formations created abstract patterns along the shoreline. Inside, a most unusual meeting was taking place. Scarlett sat in a leather chair so large it made her look even smaller, her legs swinging freely several inches above the floor. She clutched a cup of hot chocolate that the bank's executive chef had prepared, a luxury that would have seemed impossible to her just hours earlier. Across the polished mahogany table, teams of lawyers, financial advisors, and bank executives worked to unravel the most sophisticated philanthropic structure they'd ever encountered. Fahad had positioned himself near the window, ostensibly studying the lake view, but actually trying to process the emotional magnitude of what Layla had created. Every few minutes, he glanced back at Scarlett, seeing in her bright curiosity an echo of the woman who had changed his life. His wife had been a master strategist, but this revelation surpassed even his understanding of her capabilities. Dr. Eleanor Matthews spread documents across the table like a detective laying out evidence. "The structure is remarkably elegant," she explained to the room. "Mrs. Al-Mansour created what's essentially a hybrid trust. part inheritance, part investment vehicle, part social impact fund. The genius is in how she linked everything together. Patricia Holbrook, still somewhat shaken by the morning's events, managed the practical aspects with her usual efficiency. The immediate accessible funds total approximately $2.7 million, she reported. But that's just the beginning. The full structure, when activated, approaches $50 million in value. Scarlett's eyes widened at the numbers, though their true meaning remained beyond her comprehension. "Is that enough to help other kids like me?" she asked, her question cutting straight to the heart of what Layla had intended. The innocence of the question brought a profound silence to the room. Here was a child who, upon discovering she had access to more money than most people could imagine, immediately thought about others in similar situations. It was a response that would have made Layla proud. Thomas Mitchell, the bank's senior investment analyst, had been working frantically since the discovery to understand the full scope of the financial arrangement. "The remarkable thing," he said, looking up from his laptop, "is how prescient Mrs. Al-Mansour was about market conditions. Every investment she made has not only retained value but grown exponentially. It's as if she could predict economic trends years in advance." Fard smiled sadly at this observation. Layla always said that smart investing wasn't about predicting the future. It was about understanding human nature. She believed that companies focused on solving real problems would always find ways to grow. The documents revealed the depth of Layla's planning. She had established partnerships with educational institutions, healthcare facilities, and social service organizations throughout the Midwest. Each partnership was designed to create opportunities for children in situations similar to Scarlett's. Not just financial assistance, but comprehensive support systems that addressed education, healthcare, and emotional well-being. Jennifer Clark, who had initiated the morning's discovery with her simple computer search, found herself included in the high-level discussions by virtue of being present at the crucial moment. "The system integration is incredibly sophisticated," she observed. "It's like she built a secondary nervous system inside our regular banking operations. How did she do all this without anyone noticing?" Eleanor had been wondering the same thing. Her investigation into the legal structures revealed a network of shell companies, charitable foundations, and investment vehicles so carefully constructed that they appeared to be routine business operations. "Your wife," she said to Fard, "was operating at a level of financial sophistication that rivals the most experienced philanthropists, but she was doing it in complete secrecy. She was protecting Rose," Fard realized aloud, "and eventually Rose's daughter. If anyone had known about the connection, if the wrong people had discovered that Rose's family had access to this kind of wealth," he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the room understood the potential dangers that could have threatened a vulnerable family if their connection to vast financial resources had become public knowledge. Scarlett had been listening intently, processing the adult conversation through the lens of a 7-year-old's understanding. "My mama used to say that Layla was watching over us," she said quietly. She said, even though they couldn't talk anymore, Layla was still taking care of us somehow. The statement hit Fard with unexpected force. Throughout his marriage, Layla had spoken about the importance of creating positive change that would outlast their own lives. He had assumed she meant their joint philanthropic activities, the scholarships they funded, the hospitals they supported, the research initiatives they sponsored. He hadn't realized she was also orchestrating something far more personal and profound. Webb approached the table with a thick folder of newly printed documents. "Sir, we've identified 17 separate financial mechanisms that your wife established over a period of 8 years. Each one is designed to activate at different stages of Miss McKenna's life. Educational milestones, healthcare needs, housing situations, even provisions for potential family members." The scope of Layla's foresight was staggering. She had anticipated not just Scarlett's immediate needs, but potential scenarios decades into the future. College tuition, graduate school, starting a business, buying a home, supporting her own children. Every major life event had been considered and planned for. "But the most remarkable element," Eleanor continued, consulting her notes, "is the social impact component. As Miss McKenna's inheritance grows and evolves, It's designed to create opportunities for other children in similar circumstances. It's not just wealth transfer, it's a perpetual engine for social change. Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist whom the bank had hastily consulted, had been observing Scarlett throughout the meeting. The emotional intelligence required to create this structure is extraordinary, she noted. Mrs. Almansor understood that simply giving money to a child wouldn't necessarily create positive outcomes. She built in educational requirements, mentorship programs, and community engagement opportunities that will help develop character alongside financial resources. Fahd found himself thinking about his conversations with Layla about legacy, not just what they would leave behind, but how they would ensure their impact continued to grow after they were gone. She had spoken often about the difference between charity and justice, between helping individuals and changing systems. What she had created for Scarlett embodied both approaches. "There's something else," Patricia said hesitantly, consulting a document that had just been decoded. Mrs. Almansor left specific instructions about Mr. Almansor's role in all of this. Every head turned toward Patricia, and even Scarlett stopped swinging her legs. Sensing the importance of whatever was about to be revealed, she wanted him to serve as guardian and mentor to Miss McKenna, but only if circumstances required it. She wrote, "Fahd has the wisdom to guide without controlling, the resources to help without overwhelming, and the heart to love without possessing. If Rose's daughter ever needs a father figure, she couldn't find anyone better." The words landed in the quiet room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of emotion that touched everyone present. Fahd's composed demeanor finally cracked, and tears he had been holding back since Layla's death began to flow freely. Scarlett climbed down from her oversized chair and walked around the table to where Fahd stood by the window. She looked up at him with those bright green eyes and asked, "Are you sad because you miss Layla too?" Unable to trust his voice, Fahd simply nodded. "Mama said that people we love never really leave us," Scarlett said, taking his much larger hand in her small one. "She said they find ways to keep taking care of us, even when we can't see them anymore." In that moment, surrounded by lawyers and bankers and documents worth millions of dollars, Fahd understood that Layla's greatest gift wasn't the financial structure she had created. It was this moment of connection, this opportunity to help heal two broken hearts through the simple act of caring for each other. 3 weeks after the discovery that had transformed everything, Scarlett McKenna stood in the lobby of Children's Memorial Hospital, no longer the small, uncertain figure who had once struggled to be taken seriously. She wore new clothes, still simple, still age-appropriate, but clean and warm and properly fitting. More importantly, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The hospital's executive director, Dr. Amanda Foster, walked beside her, explaining the various departments and programs that would soon benefit from the Layla Al-Mansour Foundation for Children in Crisis. What had started as a personal inheritance had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive initiative designed to address the systemic issues that created situations like Scarlett's. The Emergency Assistance Program will be operational within 60 days, Dr. Foster explained as they toured the pediatric wing. Families facing sudden healthcare crises won't have to choose between treatment and basic survival. The foundation will provide bridge funding while insurance and social services sort themselves out. Scarlett nodded seriously, though the administrative details were still beyond her full comprehension. What she understood perfectly was the expressions on the faces of other children they passed. Kids who looked scared, confused, or resigned in ways that reminded her of her own reflection during the hardest months of her mother's illness. In the conference room where the Foundation's board would soon meet for the first time, Fahd was reviewing architectural plans with a team of designers and child development specialists. The space would be transformed into a family resource center, somewhere parents could access social services, educational support, and emotional counseling while their children received medical care. "The key," said Dr. Chen, who had become the Foundation's Director of Family Services, "is creating an environment where seeking help feels empowering rather than demoralizing. Too often, families in crisis encounter systems that make them feel like failures rather than people facing temporary challenges." Eleanor Matthews had been working around the clock to establish the legal framework for what was becoming the most innovative philanthropic structure in Chicago. The beauty of Mrs. Al-Mansour's original design, she explained to the assembled board members, is that it anticipates growth and evolution. As we identify new needs, new solutions can be integrated without rebuilding the entire foundation. The board itself reflected Layla's understanding that effective change required diverse perspectives. Alongside traditional philanthropic figures sat former foster children who had succeeded despite systemic obstacles, social workers who understood bureaucratic challenges from the inside, and community leaders who knew which interventions actually worked at the grassroots level. Jennifer Clark, whose simple computer search had triggered everything, found herself in the unexpected position of serving as the Foundation's Community Liaison Coordinator. Her background in customer service, it turned out, was exactly what was needed to help families navigate complex support systems with dignity and efficiency. "We're seeing applications from all over the Midwest," she reported to the group. "Single mothers trying to finish nursing school while caring for sick children, families dealing with sudden job loss during a medical crisis, kids aging out of foster care who need transitional support. The need is enormous." But perhaps the most significant development was happening between Fard and Scarlett themselves. What had begun as a legal guardianship arrangement was evolving into something much deeper, a relationship that was healing wounds neither had fully acknowledged. Scarlett's transition into Fade's Lake Shore Drive penthouse had been carefully managed by Dr. Chen and a team of specialists who understood the complexity of helping a child process both tremendous loss and sudden abundance. The apartment's guest wing had been converted into a space designed specifically for a 7-year-old, not lavishly decorated, but thoughtfully arranged to provide comfort, security, and age-appropriate stimulation. "She's remarkably resilient," Dr. Chen observed during one of her weekly check-ins with Fard. "Children often adapt to new circumstances more easily than adults, but Scarlett seems to have an unusual emotional intelligence about her situation. She understands that her life has changed dramatically, but she hasn't lost sight of where she came from." This understanding manifested itself in small but significant ways. Scarlett insisted on keeping her mother's few belongings in a special place in her new room. She asked to visit the apartment where she and Rose had lived, wanting to ensure the neighbors knew she was okay. Most tellingly, she consistently directed conversations about the foundation back to practical questions about helping other families avoid the struggles she remembered. Fard found himself rediscovering aspects of himself that had been dormant since Layla's death. The man who had built a business empire through calculated decisions and strategic thinking was learning to navigate the unpredictable world of caring for a grieving child who asked questions that cut straight to the heart of what mattered. "Why did Layla make it so complicated?" Scarlett asked one evening as they reviewed foundation proposals together. It had become their routine. Fard would explain the day's philanthropic decisions in terms she could understand, and she would offer perspectives that consistently surprised the adults around her. "What do you mean?" Fard asked, looking up from a proposal for expanding mental health services in public schools. She could have just given Mama money directly. Why did she make all these rules and systems and stuff? It was a question that had occurred to Fard many times over the past weeks, and his answer reflected months of trying to understand his late wife's thinking. "I think," he said slowly, "Layla wanted to make sure the help would keep going even after you didn't need it anymore. If she had just given your mother money, it would have helped your family. But by creating the foundation, she made sure thousands of families could be helped." Scarlett considered this explanation seriously. "So she was thinking about kids who aren't even born yet." "Exactly. That's really smart," Scarlett concluded, "but also kind of sad, because it means she knew she wasn't going to be around to help them herself." The insight was so profound that Fard felt his breath catch. This 7-year-old had articulated something that teams of lawyers and financial advisors had missed. That Layla's entire elaborate structure was ultimately an expression of grief, a way of continuing to care for vulnerable children from beyond the grave. That night, after Scarlett had fallen asleep, Fard stood in his study looking at a photograph of Layla taken during their last vacation together. She had been working on her laptop even on the beach, and he had teased her about being unable to disconnect from business. Now he understood that she hadn't been working on business at all. She had been working on hope. The next morning brought news that would test every system they had put in place. Patricia Holbrook called the Foundation's emergency line to report a situation that matched their criteria exactly. A family of 4 facing eviction while their youngest child underwent leukemia treatment. Parents choosing between rent payments and medical expenses. Within 6 hours, the Layla Al-Mansour Foundation had provided emergency housing assistance, connected the family with long-term social services, and arranged for educational support for the siblings whose school attendance had suffered during the crisis. More importantly, they had done so in a way that preserved the family's dignity and empowered them to rebuild sustainably. This is what Layla envisioned, Fad told Scarlett as they reviewed the successful intervention, a system that catches families before they fall rather than trying to help them climb back up afterward. Scarlett nodded, then asked the question that had become her trademark. How many more families can we help this month? It was a question that would drive everything they did going forward, not just the measure of their success, but the motivation for their continued growth. And in asking it, a 7-year-old girl was ensuring that her guardian angel's vision would continue expanding in ways that even Layla might not have imagined. 6 months had transformed not just Scarlett's life, but the entire landscape of child welfare services across Chicago. The Layla Al-Mansour Foundation had become a model that other cities were studying, and requests for consultation were arriving from social service organizations as far away as Los Angeles and Miami. What had begun as one woman's secret plan to help one child had evolved into a movement that was changing how society approached family crisis intervention. Scarlett, now 8 years old and finishing 2nd grade at the prestigious Lincoln Park Academy, had become an unlikely but powerful voice in philanthropic circles. Her weekly foundation meetings weren't mere formalities. The board had learned that her questions consistently identified blind spots in their planning that experienced professionals had missed. "Why do we only help families after something bad happens?" she asked during a particularly intense discussion about expanding services. "Wouldn't it be smarter to help them before the bad things happen?" The question sparked a 3-hour strategic planning session that would ultimately reshape the Foundation's entire approach. Within weeks, they were developing preventive programs focused on financial literacy, healthcare navigation, and educational support for at-risk families, interventions designed to build resilience before crises occurred. Fad watched these transformations with a mixture of pride and amazement. The shy billionaire who had once managed his empire from behind closed doors now found himself testifying before city council committees, speaking at university conferences, and collaborating with community organizers who approached philanthropy from entirely different philosophical frameworks. "Your daughter," said Maria Gonzalez, director of the Southside Community Center, "has an extraordinary ability to cut through bureaucratic nonsense and focus on what actually matters." They were sitting in Maria's office, reviewing a joint initiative to create family resource hubs in underserved neighborhoods. The relationship between Fahad and Scarlett had settled into something that transcended traditional definitions, not quite father and daughter, but something deeper than guardian and ward. They were partners in continuing Layla's work, bound together by shared purpose as much as growing affection. "She gets that from her mother," Fahad replied, though he was thinking as much about Layla as about Rose McKenna. Both women had possessed an intuitive understanding of what vulnerable families actually needed, as opposed to what institutions thought they needed. The Foundation's impact was being measured in ways that went far beyond financial metrics. Dr. Foster at Children's Memorial Hospital reported a 30% reduction in emergency department visits for non-medical crises. Families who once would have ended up in the ER because they had nowhere else to turn were now accessing appropriate support services before situations became desperate. Public schools throughout the city were reporting improved attendance rates and academic performance among children whose families had received foundation assistance. More significantly, teachers were noticing that these children seemed more emotionally stable, better able to focus on learning because they weren't worried about basic security issues at home. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening within Scarlett herself. The traumatized little girl who had once stood outside the bank in worn shoes, afraid to ask for help, was becoming a confident young person who understood her own agency in creating positive change. "I want to visit the Southside Center next week," she announced during dinner at Fad's penthouse. They ate together every evening now, a routine that had evolved naturally as both of them craved the stability of predictable connection. "Any particular reason?" Fard asked, though he had learned to trust Scarlett's instincts about where the Foundation's attention was needed. Mrs. Gonzalez said, "There are kids there who are taking care of their little brothers and sisters because their parents work 3 jobs. I want to understand how that feels." The emotional intelligence embedded in that statement took Fard's breath away. Scarlett wasn't interested in visiting the community center as a benefactor or observer. She wanted to understand the lived experience of children facing challenges she herself had never quite encountered. It was an approach to philanthropy that emphasized empathy over sympathy, connection over charity. Eleanor Matthews had been documenting these developments for a case study that Harvard Business School had requested about innovative philanthropic structures. "But what's unprecedented," she explained to a visiting researcher, "is how the Foundation has managed to maintain both large-scale impact and individual responsiveness. Most organizations have to choose between broad reach and personal attention. The secret," Eleanor had discovered, lay in the decentralized decision-making structure that Layla had embedded in the Foundation's design. Rather than requiring all decisions to flow through a central authority, the system empowered local coordinators to respond immediately to family needs, while maintaining oversight and quality standards. Jennifer Clark, who had transitioned from bank reception to Foundation coordination, was managing a team of 12 community liaisons who worked directly with families throughout the metropolitan area. Each liaison was someone who had either received Foundation assistance themselves or worked extensively with vulnerable populations, people who understood both the systemic obstacles and the human resilience that characterized families in crisis. "The families teach us as much as we help them," Jennifer explained to a documentary crew that was filming the Foundation's work. "Every intervention teaches us something new about what actually works versus what we think should work." This learning orientation had led to several course corrections that improved the Foundation's effectiveness dramatically. Early programs focused heavily on financial assistance, but feedback from families revealed that navigation support, helping people understand and access existing social services, was often more valuable than direct monetary help. The Foundation had also discovered that their most successful interventions involved connecting families with each other, rather than just with professional services, support groups for single parents managing medical crises, mentorship programs, matching families who had successfully navigated specific challenges with those currently facing similar situations. Community gardens where neighbors could work together while children played safely. These relationship-building initiatives had outcomes that surprised everyone. Scarlett's influence on these developments was both direct and subtle. Her questions during board meetings consistently pushed the Foundation to center children's perspectives in program design. Her insistence on visiting program sites meant that theoretical plans were constantly tested against real-world conditions. Most importantly, her own story served as a constant reminder that effective help required understanding people as complete human beings rather than collections of problems to be solved. The transformation was evident in small details that might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but meant everything to families receiving assistance. Foundation offices were designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. Staff were trained to approach every interaction with the assumption that families were experts on their own circumstances. Application processes were streamlined to minimize bureaucratic barriers while maintaining appropriate oversight. "We're not trying to save anyone," Scarlett had said during a radio interview that had gone viral on social media. "We're trying to give people what they need so they can save themselves." The statement had become an unofficial motto for the Foundation, printed on materials and quoted in speeches across the country. But for Fard, the words represented something even more significant, evidence that his unconventional family was successfully carrying forward Layla's vision while adapting it to meet needs she couldn't have anticipated. That evening, as he and Scarlett reviewed applications for the Foundation's newest initiative, a program providing emergency childcare for families dealing with medical crises, Fard found himself thinking about the impossible chain of events that had brought them together. A sick mother's fading memory, a piece of paper with an address, a computer search that revealed secrets no one knew existed. Do you ever wonder, he asked Scarlett, say, what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to come into the bank that day? Scarlett considered the question seriously, as she always did. I think Layla would have found another way, she said finally. People like her always find ways to take care of people like us. It was a statement of faith that summarized everything the Foundation had learned about human resilience and interconnection. And it pointed toward a future where the work they were doing together would continue growing in ways that none of them could fully imagine. 2 years after the discovery that had changed everything, the Layla Al-Mansour Foundation had evolved into something that transcended traditional philanthropy. The annual gala at the Palmer House Hilton wasn't just a fundraising event. It was a celebration of what happened when people understood that helping each other wasn't charity, but community. Scarlett, now 10 years old and poised beyond her years, stood at the podium looking out over an audience that included everyone from billionaire donors to former foundation recipients who had rebuilt their lives and were now volunteering to help others. She wore a simple blue dress that Layla had chosen for her before she was even born. Found among the carefully preserved items Layla had left for Rose's daughter in a safety deposit box that had only recently been opened. 2 years ago, Scarlett began, her voice clear and confident in the way that came naturally to children who had learned they had important things to say. I was a little girl who thought I had nothing. Tonight, I'm standing in front of all of you because I learned that I actually had everything. I just needed help figuring out how to use it. The audience listened with the focused attention that Scarlett had learned to command, not through volume or drama, but through the simple power of authentic truth-telling. In the back of the room, Fahd watched with emotions too complex to name: pride, gratitude, wonder, and a bittersweet recognition that the small girl who had once needed his protection was becoming a young woman who might soon be protecting others. The foundation isn't really about money, Scarlett continued. I know that sounds weird, because obviously we use money to help people, but what we're really about is helping people remember that they're not alone, that their problems aren't too big or too embarrassing or too complicated for someone to care about solving. Dr. Chen, now the Foundation's chief operating officer, had been tracking outcomes that went far beyond traditional charitable metrics. The families they had assisted showed dramatic improvements, not just in immediate circumstances, but in long-term stability, educational achievement, and community engagement. More significantly, many were now volunteering with organizations that helped other families, creating what economists called a positive feedback loop, but what Scarlett called people helping people who help people. The Foundation's model was being replicated in 14 other cities, each adaptation reflecting local needs and resources, while maintaining the core principles that Layla had embedded in the original structure. University social work programs were sending graduate students to study the Foundation's approach to trauma-informed family services. Policy researchers were documenting how preventive interventions could reduce long-term social service costs while improving family outcomes. But for Fahd, the most meaningful changes weren't captured in any research study. They were visible in moments like watching Scarlett help a nervous 6-year-old practice reading at the Foundation's after-school program, or observing her natural ability to ask exactly the right questions when families were struggling to articulate what they needed. Jennifer Clark had been promoted to Director of Operations, overseeing a staff of 47 people who coordinated services across the greater Chicago area. Her background in customer service, initially seen as a coincidental qualification, had proven essential for creating systems that treated every family interaction as an opportunity to build trust rather than merely process applications. The secret, Jennifer explained to a delegation from Detroit who were considering implementing a similar program, is that we don't try to fix people. We try to understand what's preventing them from fixing themselves, and then we remove those obstacles. It sounded simple in principle, but the practice required sophisticated coordination between healthcare systems, educational institutions, housing services, and employment programs. The Foundation had become a kind of social infrastructure, connecting existing resources in ways that made them more accessible and effective for families, navigating multiple challenges simultaneously. Eleanor Matthews, who had left her position at the bank to serve as the Foundation's general counsel, was developing legal frameworks that other philanthropic organizations could adapt for their own work. What Mrs. Al-Mansour created, she explained in law journal articles that were being widely cited, was essentially a new model of inheritance, one that treats community well-being as a form of wealth that can be passed down across generations. The concept was gaining attention from estate planning attorneys, social impact investors, and policymakers interested in systemic approaches to poverty reduction. But it was also inspiring individual families to think differently about their own legacies, what they wanted to leave behind, and how they could ensure their values continued influencing the world after they were gone. For Scarlett, these larger implications were interesting, but not as important as the daily reality of being part of something that made life better for families like the one she and her mother had been. She maintained relationships with children throughout the Foundation's network, serving as both mentor and friend to kids who were navigating challenges she understood intimately. The hardest part, she told a group of 8-year-olds during a Foundation workshop, isn't asking for help. It's believing that you deserve help. But you do deserve it. Everyone deserves to have people who care about whether they're okay. These workshops had emerged organically from Scarlett's desire to share what she had learned about resilience, hope, and the importance of accepting support from others. They weren't therapy sessions or formal educational programs. They were conversations between children who understood that life could be scary and uncertain, but also that scary and uncertain didn't mean hopeless. Dr. Foster at Children's Memorial Hospital had documented remarkable improvements in treatment compliance and emotional stability among young patients who participated in these peer support conversations. There's something powerful, she noted, about children learning from other children that difficult circumstances don't define their entire future. The Foundation's reach was expanding beyond crisis intervention into what they called opportunity creation, scholarships for students interested in healthcare or social work, internships with community organizations, and mentorship programs connecting young people with adults who had navigated similar life challenges successfully. Fahd found himself serving as a mentor figure for several teenagers who were aging out of foster care or preparing for college as first-generation students. The relationships taught him as much as they provided guidance. Young people who helped him understand perspectives on opportunity and challenge that his privileged background had never required him to consider. "You're different than I expected," said Marcus, a 17-year-old who had been receiving Foundation support since his family's apartment fire 3 years earlier. "I thought all rich people were kind of out of touch, but you actually listen." The comment prompted reflection that Fahd shared with Scarlett later that evening. "I think," he said, "Layla knew that helping other people would change me as much as it changed them. She probably understood that I needed to learn how to be part of a community, not just someone who observed it from a distance." Scarlett nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why she made it so that you had to take care of me to access your own money. She knew you needed practice taking care of people before you could take care of everybody." It was an insight that crystallized something Fahd had been sensing, but couldn't articulate, that his relationship with Scarlett had taught him how to approach philanthropy as relationship rather than transaction, how to offer support that empowered rather than created dependency. As the gala evening continued with performances by children from the Foundation's arts programs and presentations about expanding services, Fahd watched Scarlett move through the crowd with natural grace, equally comfortable talking with major donors and with families who had received assistance. She had grown into someone who could bridge different worlds, not by changing herself for each audience, but by finding the common humanity that connected everyone. Later that night, as they drove home along Lakeshore Drive, Scarlett asked the question that had become her trademark. "What do you think Layla would want us to do next?" It was a question that kept them both oriented toward growth and innovation rather than resting on their accomplishments. And increasingly, it was a question that generated answers neither of them could have imagined when a 7-year-old girl in worn shoes first walked into a bank to check on a piece of paper that held more hope than anyone had realized. 5 years had passed since that transformational winter morning, and the Chicago skyline had become a backdrop to stories of change that rippled far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The Layla Al-Mansour Foundation had evolved into a network of interconnected organizations across North America, each adapted to local needs, but united by the principle that effective help required understanding people as complete human beings rather than collections of problems to be solved. Scarlett, now 13 and in 8th grade, had developed into a young woman whose wisdom seemed to exceed her years, while her genuine curiosity about the world around her remained charmingly childlike. She divided her time between advanced academic studies at Lincoln Park Academy, foundation work that had become her passion, and the normal teenager activities that Fad insisted were essential for her development. The foundation's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a renovated building in River North, its design reflecting the same principles that guided their programs: welcoming, dignified, and focused on bringing people together rather than separating them by economic status or social circumstances. On any given day, the building buzzed with activity that would have seemed impossible in a traditional charitable organization: former clients training to become service coordinators, university researchers collaborating with community organizers, children doing homework while their parents attended financial literacy classes. "What we've learned," Scarlett explained to a delegation from the European Union who were studying innovative approaches to social services, "is that people aren't broken. Systems are broken. When you fix the systems, people fix themselves." The statement reflected 5 years of experimentation, evaluation, and adaptation that had transformed not just the Foundation's approach, but the entire field of family support services. Policymakers from 12 countries had visited Chicago to study what was being called the McKenna Model, an integrated approach to social services that treated families as experts on their own circumstances while providing comprehensive support for addressing systemic barriers to stability. Fad, who had initially approached philanthropy as a way to honor his late wife's memory, now understood that he had become part of something much larger, a movement that was redefining how society understood responsibility for collective well-being. His business empire continued to grow, but increasingly his attention was focused on ventures that aligned with the Foundation's mission of creating systemic change rather than merely generating wealth. Dr. Chen, who had guided both Scarlett's emotional development and the Foundation's programmatic evolution, was completing research that would be published as a landmark study on trauma-informed philanthropy. "What's remarkable," she observed, "is how consistently we find that the most effective interventions come from understanding strength rather than focusing on deficit. Families in crisis aren't lacking in capability, they're lacking in resources and support systems." This insight had led to program innovations that were being replicated internationally. The Foundation's Family Navigator program trained community members who had successfully addressed specific challenges to guide others through similar situations. Their Resilience Circles connected families facing different but related difficulties, creating mutual support networks that reduced isolation while building practical problem-solving skills. Perhaps most significantly, the Foundation's Future Leaders Initiative was identifying and supporting young people from challenging backgrounds who showed potential for creating positive change in their communities. The program provided comprehensive support, educational funding, mentorship, internship opportunities, and ongoing guidance, while encouraging participants to maintain strong connections with their home communities. Marcus Williams, the teenager who had once challenged Fahed's assumptions about wealth and perspective, was now a sophomore at Northwestern University studying social work and policy analysis. He worked part-time at the Foundation while maintaining a near-perfect academic record, and his senior project would focus on developing mental health support programs for youth aging out of foster care. "The Foundation saved my family," he said during a panel discussion about effective youth development programs, "but more importantly, it taught me that I could help save other families. That's a different kind of education than you get in most schools." Jennifer Clark had become a nationally recognized expert in community-based social services, consulting with organizations across the country while maintaining her leadership role at the Foundation. Her background in customer service continued to influence program design in ways that prioritize dignity and respect over efficiency and cost-effectiveness. "We measure success differently than most organizations," she explained to a congressional subcommittee studying innovative approaches to poverty reduction. "We don't just count how many families we help. We track whether families feel empowered by their interactions with us. Do they leave feeling more capable than when they arrived? Do they understand they have agency in improving their circumstances? The Foundation's data collection systems, developed in partnership with researchers from the University of Chicago and Northwestern, tracked both immediate outcomes and long-term community impact. Families who received Foundation support showed higher rates of educational achievement, employment stability, and community engagement compared to similar families who accessed traditional social services. More remarkably, their children showed improved academic performance and emotional resilience that persisted years after the initial intervention. But for Scarlett, the most meaningful measure of success wasn't captured in any database. It was visible in the confidence she saw in children who reminded her of herself at 7 years old. Kids who no longer looked down when adults spoke to them, who asked questions without apologizing for not knowing things, who understood that needing help wasn't evidence of personal failure, but proof of human interconnection. So every kid should know, she said during a TED Talk that would be viewed millions of times, that there are people in the world who care whether they're okay, even if those people haven't met them yet. That's not charity, that's how families are supposed to work. And if we're all human, then we're all family. The speech had been delivered without notes. Emerging from Scarlett's natural ability to articulate complex ideas in language that resonated across age and cultural differences, the audience had included everyone from Nobel Prize winners to elementary school students, but her message reached all of them with equal impact. Fahd watched from the wings, marveling at the young woman who had grown from a frightened child into someone who could command international attention while remaining genuinely curious about other people's experiences. Their relationship had evolved beyond guardian and ward into something that felt like chosen family, people who had found each other through extraordinary circumstances and decided to build something meaningful together. Layla would be proud, he told Scarlett after the speech, a comment that had become their shorthand for acknowledging that they were living up to the vision that had brought them together. I think she'd also be proud of you, Scarlett replied, a response that always surprised him with its perceptiveness. You could have just written checks and felt good about yourself. Instead, you learned how to be part of something bigger. That evening, as they reviewed applications for the Foundation's newest initiative, a program providing entrepreneurship support for women leaving domestic violence situations, Scarlett asked the question that continued to drive their work forward. What do you think would happen if every city had something like what we've built here? It was a question that kept them both oriented toward expansion and replication rather than simply maintaining what they had created. And increasingly, it was generating answers that suggested their work was contributing to a fundamental shift in how society understood the relationship between individual well-being and collective responsibility. The Foundation's influence was spreading through networks of relationships rather than formal institutional channels. Former recipients who had rebuilt their lives were creating similar programs in their new communities. University graduates who had participated in Foundation programs were bringing their experience to social work positions, non-profit organizations, and policy development roles across the country. We're not trying to franchise ourselves, Eleanor Matthews explained to organizations interested in replicating the Foundation's model. We're trying to demonstrate that when you treat people with dignity and provide comprehensive support, they don't just solve their immediate problems, they become resources for solving other people's problems. As they prepared for bed in the penthouse that had become home for both of them, Scarlett and Fahd continued their evening tradition of reflecting on the day's work and planning for tomorrow's challenges. It was a routine that had evolved naturally as they both craved the stability of predictable connection, but it also served as a way of staying grounded in purpose, even as their work grew increasingly complex and far-reaching. Do you ever miss the time when it was just about helping one family at a time? Fahd asked, thinking about the simplicity of their early interventions compared to the sophisticated systems they now managed. Scarlett considered the question seriously. I think we're still helping one family at a time, she said finally. It's just that now we understand how many families there are. 10 years after that fateful winter morning, Scarlett McKenna stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, representing a coalition of youth advocates from around the world. At 18, she had become the youngest person ever to address the Assembly on matters of global poverty and social justice. But her presence there wasn't symbolic. She was presenting concrete policy recommendations based on a decade of real-world experience, changing how societies support vulnerable families. The assembly hall was packed with delegates, activists, and media representatives from 193 countries. In the front row sat Fahd al-Mansour, now recognized as one of the world's leading social impact investors, his eyes filled with pride and anticipation. Beside him were Dr. Chen, Jennifer Clark, Eleanor Matthews, and Marcus Williams, the team that had helped transform one child's inheritance into a global movement. 10 years ago, Scarlett began, her voice carrying the same clarity and conviction that had always been her trademark. I was a 7-year-old girl who walked into a bank because I believed there had been a mistake. Today, I stand before you because we discovered that the real mistake wasn't mine. It was how we think about helping each other. The speech that followed would be remembered as a turning point in international discussions about poverty, human dignity, and systemic change. Scarlett presented evidence from 847 programs across 6 continents that had adopted the Foundation's principles, demonstrating that when societies invested in comprehensive family support rather than crisis intervention, the outcomes transformed entire communities. We've proven that poverty isn't a character flaw, it's a resource distribution problem, she continued. And we've proven that people don't need to be saved. They need barriers removed so they can save themselves. The data she presented was staggering. Communities that had implemented integrated family support systems showed 73% reduction in emergency social service usage, 89% improvement in childhood educational outcomes, and 156% increase in local economic activity. More importantly, they showed measurable improvements in community cohesion, civic engagement, and intergenerational mobility. But as Scarlett reached the climax of her presentation, she shifted from statistics to story. "The woman who made all of this possible never met me," she said, her voice softening with emotion. "Layla Al-Mansour died 3 years before I was born, but she understood something that we're still learning, that love doesn't end with death if you build systems that keep caring for people after you're gone." The hall was completely silent now, delegates leaning forward to hear every word. She also understood that helping one child was never going to be enough. She created a structure that would help thousands of children, and those children would grow up to help millions more. She turned inheritance into investment, charity into justice, and individual kindness into systemic change. Scarlett paused, looking out over the assembly with the same bright green eyes that had once peered hopefully through a bank's glass doors. Today, the Layla Al-Mansour Foundation network operates in 43 countries. We've directly assisted over 2.3 million families, but more importantly, we've demonstrated that a different approach to social support is possible. We've shown that when you treat people as experts on their own lives, provide comprehensive assistance rather than piecemeal charity, and build systems that create opportunity rather than manage poverty, everything changes. The ovation that followed lasted 14 minutes, unprecedented in the Assembly's history. But for Scarlett, the real success wasn't measured in applause, but in the commitments that emerged from the presentation. 17 countries announced immediate plans to pilot integrated family support programs. The World Bank committed $2.8 billion to scaling evidence-based community development initiatives. Most significantly, the UN voted to establish a new framework for measuring social progress that prioritized family stability and community resilience alongside traditional economic indicators. As delegates surrounded Scarlett with congratulations and questions, Fahd remained in his seat, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had unfolded from such simple beginnings. A sick mother's determination to help her daughter, a dead woman's love expressed through financial complexity, a frightened child's courage to ask for help. All of it had led to this moment when the world's leaders were committing to change how entire societies approached human well-being. "She did it," he whispered to himself, thinking simultaneously of Layla, Rose McKenna, and the remarkable young woman who had just challenged the world to live up to its highest aspirations. Later that evening, in their hotel suite overlooking Central Park, Scarlett and Fahd sat together reviewing the day's commitments and planning for the implementation work that would follow. It was a continuation of their 10-year tradition of evening reflection, but tonight carried the weight of knowing they had crossed a threshold from local impact to global influence. "What do you think happens next?" Fad asked, a question that had replaced Scarlett's childhood inquiries about what Layla would want them to do. "I think," Scarlett said, looking out at the lights of the city, where millions of people were facing challenges they could help address, "we get back to work, helping one family at a time. It's just that now there are teams of people all over the world doing that same work." It was a response that captured everything they had learned about sustainable change, that transformation happened through consistent daily actions guided by clear principles, not through dramatic gestures or grand pronouncements. And as they began planning their return to Chicago the next morning, both understood that their most important work still lay ahead. 15 years after Scarlett McKenna first walked into First National Private Bank, she stood in the same marble lobby where her life had changed forever. The building now housed the Layla Al-Mansour Institute for Social Innovation, a research and training center that welcomed visitors from around the world who came to study effective approaches to community-based family support. The lobby looked much the same: polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the sense of dignified prosperity, but its purpose had been transformed. Where once only wealthy clients had been welcomed, now families from every economic background came for services, training, and support. The security guard who greeted visitors was Thomas Rodriguez, the same man who had noticed a small girl hovering outside in the cold all those years ago. "Dr. McKenna," he said with a warm smile as Scarlett entered. She had completed her doctorate in social work and policy analysis at age 22, but Thomas still remembered her as the determined child who had changed everything simply by believing she belonged somewhere she had never been welcome. Scarlett, now 23 and leading the Institute's research division, moved through the building with the confidence of someone who had found her life's purpose early and pursued it without compromise. Her work had evolved from personal experience to academic expertise to global influence, but she maintained the same curiosity about individual stories that had always driven her approach to systemic change. Fahad, at 53, divided his time between managing investments that aligned with their social impact goals and mentoring the next generation of leaders who were emerging from their programs. His relationship with Scarlett had evolved into something that transcended all conventional categories: chosen family, intellectual partnership, and shared commitment to continuing work that honored the woman who had brought them together. The Institute's main conference room was filled with representatives from the 47 countries that now hosted foundation programs. Today's gathering was different from the formal presentations and policy meetings that had characterized their international work. This was a celebration of stories, a chance for people to share how their lives had been changed by programs that started with one woman's secret plan to help one child. Maria Santos from São Paulo spoke about the community resource centers that had reduced family separation rates by 84% in her city's favelas. Dr. James Okoye from Lagos described healthcare navigation programs that had eliminated medical bankruptcies in 3 Nigerian states. Sarah Runningbear from South Dakota explained how culturally adapted family support services had helped preserve indigenous languages while addressing contemporary challenges. But the most moving presentation came from Marcus Williams, now Dr. Marcus Williams, who had returned to Chicago to direct the Institute's youth leadership development programs. He stood where Scarlett had once stood as a frightened 7-year-old, addressing an audience that included children who reminded him of himself at 17, young people who had faced enormous challenges but were discovering they had the power to transform not just their own circumstances, but their entire communities. "The foundation didn't rescue me," he said, looking directly at a group of teenagers from the South Side who were participating in the Institute's summer leadership program. "It gave me tools to rescue myself, and then it taught me that the best way to stay rescued is to help other people find their own tools." As the day continued with workshops, presentations, and planning sessions for expanding programs to underserved regions worldwide, Scarlett found herself thinking about the impossible chain of connections that had led to this moment. Her mother's love expressed through careful preservation of a piece of paper. Layla's foresight in creating systems that would outlast her own life, Fard's willingness to be changed by unexpected circumstances, her own childhood courage to believe she deserved help. That evening, she and Fard walked along the lakefront, where they had taken countless walks over the years, discussing everything from foundation strategy to teenage worries to philosophical questions about how individual actions ripple outward through communities and across generations. "Do you think we've done what Layla hoped we would do?" Scarlett asked, a question that had evolved from her childhood inquiries, but maintained the same core curiosity about living up to the trust that had been placed in them. Fard considered the question as they watched the sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in colors that reminded them both of the first evening they had spent together as an unlikely family. "I think," he said finally, "we've done what Layla hoped, and also discovered things she couldn't have imagined. But mostly, I think we've proven that love multiplies when you give it away systematically." As they headed home to the penthouse that had become the center of a life built around service and connection, Scarlett realized that the mistake she had thought existed 15 years ago hadn't been about money or banking or inheritance. The mistake had been in thinking she was alone, that her problems were too big for anyone to care about solving, that asking for help was evidence of inadequacy rather than proof of wisdom. "There was never a mistake," she said aloud, the realization crystallizing something she had been understanding gradually for years. "What do you mean?" Fard asked. "That day at the bank I kept saying, 'I think there's a mistake,' but there wasn't a mistake. Everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to happen. Layla knew I would need help. She knew you would provide it. And she knew that helping me would help you become who you were supposed to be, too." It was a conclusion that honored both the intentionality of Layla's planning and the countless choices that had transformed obligation into love, charity into justice, and individual healing into collective transformation. Every child deserves to know that someone cares whether they're okay, even before they meet that someone. Every family facing impossible choices deserves comprehensive support that treats them as experts on their own circumstances. Every community has the resources to help its most vulnerable members. They just need systems that connect those resources effectively. You don't need to be a billionaire to create change that echoes across generations. You need to believe that helping one person well can teach you how to help many people better. You need to understand that effective assistance empowers rather than creates dependency. And you need to start where you are, with what you have, knowing that consistent small actions guided by clear principles can transform entire communities. The Layla Al-Mansour model isn't complicated. Treat people with dignity, provide comprehensive support that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms, and build systems that help families help themselves. Whether you're volunteering at a local food bank, mentoring a young person, or advocating for policy changes that make basic services more accessible, you can apply these principles to multiply your impact. Start by asking better questions. Instead of, "How can we help the poor?" ask, "What barriers prevent people from accessing the resources they need to solve their own problems?" Instead of, "What do these families lack?" ask, "What strengths do they have that aren't being supported effectively?" Then listen to the answers from people with lived experience of the challenges you want to address. Build programs based on what actually works rather than what feels good to provide. Measure success by whether people feel empowered by their interactions with your assistance, not just whether their immediate problems are temporarily solved. Most importantly, remember that transformation happens through relationship, not transaction. The goal isn't to save anyone, it's to create conditions where people can save themselves and then build systems that help them help others do the same. There's no mistake in believing that every person has something valuable to contribute to their community. There's no mistake in thinking that comprehensive support creates stronger outcomes than piecemeal charity. And there's no mistake in understanding that the best way to honor the people who have helped you is to become someone who helps others. The question isn't whether you can make a difference. The question is, what kind of difference will you choose to make?